The gnome was still standing. Every other one had been shattered. 12 in total, over 4 months. But this one stood untouched in the center of the garden at 3:47 in the morning, its ceramic eyes catching the motion sensor light as the figure in the silk robe crept across the dew-soaked lawn. She raised the mallet. And then the gnome spoke. Delia Marsh had lived at 14 Renfield Court for 11 years before Corinne Vast moved in next door. And in those 11 years, she had done nothing more controversial than paint her mailbox a shade of slate blue that was, technically, 2 points darker than the HOA-approved palette. She had raised tomatoes in raised beds along the fence line, kept her lawn edged with obsessive precision, and decorated her front garden with a rotating cast of ceramic gnomes that she repainted herself every spring, each one a small act of personal joy in a neighborhood that had slowly legislated the joy out of everything else. Thought the gnomes were not large. They were not offensive. They were, by any reasonable standard, charming. Delia had started collecting them after her divorce from Marcus. Not out of sentimentality, but out of spite. Spite against the empty hours. Spite against the silence of a house that had once had 2 voices in it. She had named the first one Harold and placed him near the hydrangeas. And something about the ridiculous permanence of a ceramic man in a red hat standing in her garden had made her feel, for the first time in a long time, like she owned something that no one could take away from her. Then Corinne Vast arrived. Corinne moved into 16 Renfield Court in early April with a moving truck. A small, quiet husband named Philip, who seemed to communicate primarily through blinking, and an air of institutional authority that she wore the way other women wore perfume. Everywhere, all the time, impossible to ignore. She had short blonde hair cut in a way that suggested efficiency rather than style. A wardrobe composed exclusively of pressed khakis and polo shirts in muted earth tones. And a clipboard that she carried during her first walk around the neighborhood, making notes in a handwriting so small and precise it looked like the output of a very particular machine. She introduced herself to Delia on a Wednesday afternoon when Delia was kneeling in the garden, repainting the hat of a gnome she called Ferdinand. "I'm Corinne Vast," she said, standing on the sidewalk with her clipboard pressed against her chest. "I just moved in next door. I wanted to introduce myself and also to let you know that I've already submitted my application to join the HOA board." Delia looked up from Ferdinand's hat. "Welcome to the neighborhood." "Thank you. I also want to be upfront with you, neighbor to neighbor." Corinne's gaze moved from Delia to the garden with the clinical assessment of someone reviewing a zoning violation. "The gnomes are a problem." Delia set down her brush. "I'm sorry?" Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the Renfield Code, OA, Guidelines specifies that decorative lawn ornaments must not exceed 12 inches in height and must be, and I'm quoting directly, of a tasteful and harmonious aesthetic consistent with the community standard. Corinne tapped the clipboard. "Your gnomes are 14 inches. I measured." Delia stared at her. "You measured my gnomes." "Before I introduced myself, yes. I find it's more efficient to come prepared." Corinne offered a smile that was anatomically correct, but emotionally vacant. "I'm sure you understand. This is a community, and communities have standards for a reason. I'd appreciate your cooperation." She walked back to her own house without waiting for a response. Delia sat in her garden for a long time after that, looking at Ferdinand. Then she went inside, pulled out the HOA handbook, a document she had never read past the first page, and found Section 7, Paragraph 3. Corinne had quoted it accurately. The limit was 12 inches. Ferdinand was 14. Delia measured him 3 times to be sure, then set the tape measure down on her kitchen counter and felt something harden in her chest. It was a quiet, particular kind of anger, the kind that doesn't explode. the kind that calcifies. She drove to the garden center the following Saturday, selected 4 new gnomes, brought them home, and measured every single one. They were all, to the inch, 11 3/4 inches tall. She placed them in the garden alongside Harold and the others. Ferdinand she moved to the backyard, where he stood among the tomatoes like a man in dignified exile. That lasted 3 weeks. The first morning she found a smashed gnome. She thought it was an accident. Gerald, a gnome she had painted with a fishing rod and a look of mild bewilderment, was lying in pieces near the edge of the lawn, scattered across the path like he had fallen from a height. She gathered the pieces, tried briefly and unsuccessfully to reassemble them, and finally placed them in the trash with the careful, quiet grief of someone burying something small. She bought a replacement, measured him, 11 3/4 inches, named him Gerald too, painted him the same way, and placed him in the same spot. 2 weeks later, Gerald II was in pieces. Then Harriet, a gnome with a wheelbarrow, was shattered. Then a gnome Delia had called simply the Professor, because he wore an expression of perpetual academic concern. Then 2 others she hadn't fully named yet. 5 gnomes in 8 weeks, always destroyed cleanly, always in the early morning, always without witnesses. Delia installed a security camera. It cost her $240 and an afternoon of frustrated YouTube tutorials. But she got it mounted under the eave of her porch, angled toward the garden, and went to bed that night with a sense of grim satisfaction when she checked the footage 2 mornings later, after finding yet another gnome. A cheerful one she had named Rosalind, reduced to shards. The timestamp read 3:44 am. The figure in the frame was blurry, moving quickly, wearing what appeared to be a silk robe. But the robe had a distinctive pattern, a thin vertical stripe at the collar and a color that looked, even in grainy black and white night vision, like it could be a rust orange. Delia had stood on Corinne's porch once, 6 weeks ago, to hand over a piece of her mail that had been misdelivered. While waiting for Corinne to answer the door, she had noticed, through the glass panel beside the door, a silk robe hanging on a hook in the hallway. It had a rust orange stripe at the collar. She watched the footage 4 more times. Then she saved it, backed it up to her phone, her laptop, and a thumb drive she labeled simply CV and placed in her desk drawer. She went to the next HOA meeting. Renfield Courts HOA held its meetings on the first Tuesday of every month in the community room of the neighborhood's central clubhouse, a low beige building with a broken water feature and an American flag that was never taken down in bad weather. The attendance was typically 5 to 8 residents, mostly retirees with legitimate grievances about parking and irrigation. The board was chaired by a man named Dennis Prawl, who wore bifocals and had been running the meetings for 9 years on the principle that if no one caused trouble, the meetings would end in under 45 minutes and he could be home for the second half of whatever sporting event was on. Corinne had joined the board 6 weeks after moving in. She had been elected by a vote of 3 to 2, with Dennis casting the deciding vote after she had brought homemade lemon bars to the previous meeting. She was now the vice chair of compliance, a title she had created and written into the agenda herself. When Delia arrived at the meeting, Corinne was seated at the table with her clipboard and a new addition, a printed agenda with her own name and title at the top. Delia sat down, placed her hands on the table, and waited. The meeting moved through parking violations, a debate about the community pool's new chemical contractor, and a proposal to add new signage near the mailboxes. Corinne noted each violation with a briskness that made Dennis look mildly uncomfortable in his own chair. Then she reached the final item on her agenda. "I want to raise the ongoing issue of decorative ornament violations in the community," Corinne said. And her eyes moved briefly, deliberately, to Delia, despite prior verbal notification. Certain residents continue to maintain front garden displays that fall outside the guidelines. My gnomes are 11 3/4 inches, Dahlia said. The issue is not exclusively height. Corinne shuffled a paper. It's also aesthetic coherence. Multiple ornaments of the same category create a visual cluster that disrupts the harmonious streetscape. That's not in Section 7. Section 12 covers general aesthetic compliance. Dennis cleared his throat. Corinne, I'm not sure we have the grounds to. I've drafted a supplemental amendment. Corinne produced a stapled document from her clipboard and slid copies across the table. It clarifies that no more than 2 decorative ornaments of the same category may be displayed in the front garden simultaneously. Dahlia took the paper. Read it. Set it down. You've been destroying my property, she said. The room went very still. I beg your pardon? Corinne said, I have security footage. Dahlia's voice was level. She had decided on the drive over that she would not raise it, that she would hold it, that she would let Corinne keep building her case, keep expanding her authority, keep pushing the compliance agenda. And then, when the moment was exactly right, she would place the footage where it would do the most damage. I'm just making a note of it. Corinne's expression did not change. I have no idea what you're referring to. I know, Delia said. And she picked up our copy of the supplemental amendment, folded it once, and p. She made a list. She needed a custom ceramic shell, large enough to be impractical to smash with a single blow, which meant she was looking at something close to 24 inches, which was, technically, a violation. But she had a specific plan for that. She needed a weatherproof housing for the electronics. She needed a Raspberry Pi, a cellular data module, a miniaturized speaker, a motion-triggered camera with a 160-degree field of view, a rechargeable battery pack with solar charging, and a cellular connection to a private server where the footage would stream live. She also needed a YouTube channel, and she needed it to already have subscribers before the gnome went up. She spent the weekend building the channel. She called it the Gnome Files, and she uploaded the existing security footage she had gathered over the previous months. Grainy, time-stamped clips of a figure in a silk robe approaching her garden in the early hours. A raised arm, a mallet coming down, shards catching the motion sensor light. She didn't show a face. She didn't name anyone. She simply described the situation in a calm, factual voiceover that she recorded sitting at her kitchen table. A neighbor, a garden, a recurring pattern of property destruction, and a question: what happens next? The first video got 4,000 views in 48 hours. She hadn't expected that. She had expected her sister in Portland to watch it, and possibly 2 or 3 neighbors who might recognize the robe. Instead, by the time the video had been up for 3 days, she had 6,000 subscribers, a comment section full of people suggesting increasingly elaborate forms of revenge, and a direct message from a local news producer at Channel 7 asking if she'd be willing to speak on camera. She told the producer she'd be in. Touch. She ordered the components. It took her 3 weeks to build the gnome. She worked in her garage on a folding table with her reading glasses and a soldering iron and the particular, focused calm of a person doing something they are genuinely good at. The ceramic shell she commissioned from a local artist named Priya Sethi, who worked from a studio in the Arts District and who, when Delia explained what she needed and why, had laughed for a solid 30 seconds and then said she would make it for half price. Priya built the shell from a high-fire stoneware with a glaze that matched the look of traditional garden gnomes: red conical hat, green jacket, white beard, rosy cheeks, but at 22 inches and with walls twice the thickness of a standard ornament. It weighed 41 pounds. Delia installed the internal electronics through a sealed access panel in the base, waterproofed every seam, and ran the solar panel along the underside of the hat brim, where it was invisible from ground level that the camera was embedded in the gnome's left eye. It was, Delia acknowledged, a detail she was privately very pleased with. She poured a concrete anchor in the front garden on a Tuesday afternoon, bolted the gnome's baseplate to the anchor with stainless steel hardware, and connected the cellular module to her private server. She tested the stream. It worked. She stood back and looked at the gnome for a long moment. She had named him Warren. She went inside, opened her laptop, and posted the second video on the gnome files. This one was a time-lapse of Warren's construction, 4 minutes long, set to instrumental music, ending with a clean wide shot of Warren standing in the garden with the following text on screen: "The gnome is up. The camera is live. The stream is running 24/7. We're ready." The video got 40,000 views overnight. By morning, the gnome files had 62,000 subscribers. Delia made herself a cup of tea, sat at her kitchen table, and for the first time in months, she felt something she recognized after a moment. As calm, she watched Corinne's kitchen light come on at 6:47 a.m., the same time it always did. She watched Corinne come out her front door at 7:15 to get her newspaper, and she watched Corinne's eyes move to the garden next door, and she watched Corinne stop. Look at Warren. Look at the camera eye. Look back at the gnome. Then Corinne went inside. She didn't appear again. That day, Delia had expected it to take at least a week. She had underestimated Corinne's patience, or perhaps, she later thought, she had simply failed to account for the specific way that Corinne's mind worked, the way it approached problems with the same clipboard and supplemental amendment energy she brought to everything, systematically, with a plan. 3 days later, Delia found a certified letter from the HOA on her doorstep. It cited Section 7, Paragraph 3, and the supplemental amendment, which had been passed at an emergency session she hadn't been notified of, and informed her that Warren was in violation of both height restrictions and the new 2-ornament maximum, and that she had 14 days to remove him or face a daily fine of $50. Delia read the letter twice. Then she called the Channel 7 producer. The producer's name was Selene Marsh, no relation. A coincidence that the producer found briefly delightful, and she arrived at 14 Renfield Court on a Friday morning, with a camera operator named Quame and an energy that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this story. Delia made coffee. Selene sat up in the living room, reviewed the existing footage, and then looked at Delia across the coffee table with the focused attention of someone who understood that the real story was not yet fully visible. "Walk me through it from the beginning," Selene said. Delia did. She was precise. She had always been precise. She gave dates, timestamps, footage references, the text of the HOA guidelines, the text of the supplemental amendment, the certified letter with its fine schedule, and the subscriber count of the GNOME files, which had by that point reached 94,000. She explained her background as an electrical engineer. She explained the construction of Warren. She described, without accusation, only facts and footage, the figure in the silk robe with the rust-orange collar stripe, the mallet, the 12 gnomes destroyed over 4 months, the lack of any other explanation for their destruction, and the absence, across all that time, of any formal explanation or apology or acknowledgement from anyone at the HOA. Quayne filmed Warren, standing in the garden through the living room window. The gnome looked, in the morning light, improbably dignified. Selene's story ran on the evening news that Friday. It was 4 minutes long, which was, Selene told Delia afterward, an eternity in local news terms. It included the existing security footage, an interview with Delia sitting calmly in her living room, a shot of Warren in the garden, and a segment on the HOA fine. Selene had attempted to contact Corinne Vast for comment. Corinne had not responded. By Saturday morning, the Gnome Files had 218,000 subscribers. By Saturday afternoon, the story had been picked up by 3 national outlets. By Saturday evening, Renfield Court had 17 unfamiliar cars parked along its streets, their occupants standing on the sidewalk taking photographs of Warren. Delia watched this from her porch with her tea and a feeling that was not quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it, a feeling of things moving in the direction they were always going to move. Once the right pressure was applied to the right point, Corinne did not come outside on Saturday. Her blinds, which were ordinarily pulled to a precise horizontal, were closed entirely for the first time since she had moved in. On Sunday at 3:38 a.m., Warren's camera triggered. Delia's phone buzzed on her nightstand. She had set it to alert her when the motion sensor activated. She picked it up, opened the app, and looked at the live stream. Corinne was in the garden. She was wearing the silk robe. The rust-orange stripe at the collar was clearly visible in the motion-activated light. She was holding a mallet, the same mallet, or one like it, and she was standing in front of Warren with the focused, contained energy of someone who had made a decision and had committed to it fully. Delia watched. 231 other people were watching the live stream at that moment. By the time Corinne raised the mallet, the count was climbing toward 400 as notifications went out to subscribers. As word spread through comments and shares and the specific viral velocity of something happening lived that, people couldn't look away from. Warren spoke. Delia had pre-recorded the audio herself, sitting in her garage with a microphone she borrowed from her nephew. She had written the script carefully, revised it 3 times, and delivered it in a voice that was steady and clear and completely without pleasure, because pleasure would have made it small, and she wanted it to be large. The speaker in Warren's chest activated when the motion sensor hit its second threshold, close proximity, under 2 feet, and Warren said, in Delia's voice, "Calm and even. You are currently being recorded on live stream with over 400 viewers. The footage is being saved to a private server and has already been shared with local law enforcement and the Renfield Court HOA board. Please step back." Corinne froze. She stood absolutely still for a period of time that the live stream viewers would later, in the comments, debate precisely, somewhere between 6 and 12 seconds, depending on the timestamp resolution, and then she took a single step backward, and her face, caught directly in the motion sensor light, was fully visible on the camera. She looked at the gnome's left eye. She understood what she was looking at. Delia, in her bedroom, watched Corinne's face on her phone screen and felt the calcified thing in her chest crack open, not into anger, which she had expected, but into something straw,